Hello, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Computation Group. Today, we're really excited to have Nora Ammann. Her work is focused on catalyzing R&D that can help make transformative AI go well. Right now, she's at Aria in the UK, where she manages a nearly $60 million program which prototypes provable guarantees for safety-critical applications of AI. She's also coined the term gradual disempowerment and co-founded an organization that fosters interdisciplinary AI safety research. She was also a 2024 Foresight Computation Fellow. So without further ado, thank you, Nora, and we're so excited to hear about building resilience for the age of intelligence.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you guys about this. This has been a bit of a theme I was nerd-sniped by over the last couple of months, and then has been a bit of a sort of meaningfully intense side project by me and my collaborator, Eddie, that you see here as well. And it's just been pretty exciting. So I'm excited to share some of the things you've been thinking about. And there's lots more to think about. So also excited for you guys' input. Feel free throughout the talk, if you have clarifications and stuff that you want, feel free to sort of raise your hand. I'll try to leave like a good chunk of time for questions in the end. That's something like 15 minutes, maybe a bit more is what I'm aiming at. Cool. So yeah, as I've already said, this is like some work in progress that we're doing, right? So I'm like also very keen for like input, feedback, questions, thoughts, what are we missing, etc. Sweet. So air resilience. Here's the 3 guiding questions that I kind of got nerd sniped by, and I think will also sort of guide us throughout this talk. So the guiding questions are, what does it take for a civilization to be resilient in a world where there's sort of cheap and abundant artificial intelligence? That's kind of the guiding question. So like, what we can ask what it is like for a civilization to be resilient right now, and there's resilience tech out there right now, but how does that question change as intelligence gets more powerful and as well also more widely distributed? So that's kind of the guiding question. And then there's sort of 2 important sub-questions. One is, okay, what novel technological and institutional capabilities do we need to deal with that sort of evolving situation? And the third one is, how can we leverage AI itself to help us build that resilience? So with that, I have sort of three sort of chunks to the talk. First, I want to talk a little bit about what is AI resilience, what is resilience, what are we talking about here? Then I'll say just a few things about like why I think it's worth thinking about, or importantly also working on. And then the kind of more substantive or sort of most interesting maybe questions are like, how do we develop it? How do we enhance AI resilience? Cool. So what is resilience? So let's first start with what is sort of resilience in general. I'll define it as the ability of a system to maintain its core functions. That's obviously sort of contextual, right? It depends on your system, depends on your what are the core functions, etc. But just to give a bit more meat here, like some examples, let's say a system, the human body, right? Cool, we can pick that as a system. What are its core functions, or what does it mean for it to fail to maintain its core functions? It will look something like a very unhealthy human that might even die, right? That would be an example where the resilience wasn't maintained. What's an example in this context of a piece of resilience tech or a piece of resilience enhancing interventions? The fact that we sort of figured out cheap and available testing for sort of diseases helped a great deal when the last pandemic came around. So here's a sort of narrow example of a system, what it means to maintain its core function, resilience tech. We can think about a city as another system. A city burning or come crashing down will mean it won't no longer be able to maintain the functions the city is otherwise doing, housing people, letting them go from one place to the other, letting them do effective work. And there's some cool stuff that happened in the past where we sort of figured out how to build buildings in a way that's more resilient to, for example, fires, building them apart in certain ways, certain materials that are better for this, etc. And then sort of finally, the market's coming crashing down in sort of an irrecoverable way. That would really be like an issue of resilience. Like, we're not talking about, we never should have downtime, we never should have an accident, a moment of crisis. The question is, are we able to recover without sort of losing all the core functions? Circuit breakers in the stock market, right, would be an example of that we figured out to avoid these escalating flash crashes. So that's resilience. What about AI resilience? What I'm going to define it as, again, is sort of like the same story, but in this case, we're just interested in how do we think about resilience, accounting for the various effects that transformative AI has and will have, both on the offense side, so like how does that change the sort of attacks and the sort of like risks we need to be worried about, but also on the defense side, like how can we leverage AI and bring that in? So I'm using this as a sort of very broad notion. That's I think the theme here. So illustrate that a bit more. This is maybe how we can think about resilience in the typical sense. We have a traditional system and a traditional attack vector. So now we're interested in asking the systems you already have, as well as new systems that actually come into existence thanks to AI. Those will need to be resilient as well. AI systems themselves will sometimes have these functions, as well as, and then how AI changes the traditional systems. And then on the vulnerability side, the AI augmented or sort of AI changed attack vectors. So existing attack vectors that are made worse in some way by the presence of AI, as well as like maybe novel attack vectors sort of coming into play. Some concrete examples of this, right? In cyber, we might think about AI-enabled and conducted cybercrime, then changing the game. Sometimes you might be like, this is mostly a quantitative change, right? It gets easier and thus more frequent to make these cyber attacks, but that can sometimes also have qualitatively different ways you should then be looking at the risk. Biochemical system, right? Like bioengineered pathogens. In the socioeconomic domain, we might be worried about mass unemployment, collapse of safety nets, like stuff in this regime we might be worried about in the AI context.
Nora,
Institutional, yeah.
are there slides?
Oh
I think
my
I
God.
don't see your slides.
Oh,
Thanks,
I'm so
Richard,
sorry.
for flagging that.
Okay. I thought I had shared them before and then I forgot. There we go.
Oh, great.
Cool. I'll just continue on here. Sorry about that. So some examples of like AI enhanced attack vectors. One last thing I want to say in this section is how should we, civilizational resilience feels like a big topic. Some ways of breaking it down, we can just think about what are kind of the high level systems that are supporting sort of our modern life. Here is a few examples, right? There's the cyber domain, cyber physical domain, the physical, the biochemical, the epistemic, culture domain, institutional, etc. One piece of language that I found useful and have already been referring to is this notion of attack vectors / vulnerabilities. I think I'm using them sort of as a synonym. So for each of these domains, in principle, we can kind of think through, okay, for cyber, right? Like, what are the attack vectors? What are the avenues or the channels via which the core functions might be sort of brought down? So for examples, vulnerabilities in code that could be exploited, right? That's the key attack vectors in the domain of cyber. In the epistemic culture domain, you could maybe say vulnerabilities or exploits in the human or cultural software, right? As an example, that's not an exclusive list. In the biochemical process, in a very sort of generic way, we could say the way we manipulating, destroying, or repurposing these life-enabling biochemical processes, that's really the sort of attack vector that we have to be worried about and need to be guarding. And maybe sort of add an analogy here again, in the institutional case, we might be worried about manipulation, destruction, and repurposing of sort of the balance of information flows that we might be worried about. So that's this notion of attack vector, and I'll be coming back to that a good deal. Okay, so that's our first section. I now want to say a few things about why I think this is worth working on. I basically have sort of 4 high-level arguments, and I'll just go through them one by one. So I'll quickly summarize them, and then I'll say a bit more about them. So resilience is the last line of defense against unpredictable harms. Resilience enables safe diffusion of AI capabilities. Relying on governments for resilience is insufficient and sometimes undesirable. And then lastly, differential progress means accelerating resilience technology could sort of unlock outsized impact. So the first one, resilience is the last line of defense against unpredictable harms. This is an abstraction, right? Like leaky in various ways. But I think when we think about the context of AI, right, probably most of you guys are familiar with a bunch of work in AI safety and alignment, where the worry is, okay, these AI systems might in various ways end up sort of causing large scale harm. How do we defend against that? The first layer of defense is saying, looking directly at the AI system, saying, hey, how can we either change the knobs internally, and that I think would be sort of alignment, such that this AI system doesn't even end up doing any of that or is corrigible in the right way. Control, I think, is sort of a more emerging agenda that says, what if we don't manage to get this alignment thing right? Let's assume we don't. What can we do given that? And then I think that the last layer here is, if even that fails, right? If there's things still going wrong, I think the last line of defense is that we make our civilization, our social systems more capable of preventing potentially, but importantly also handling things that could be going wrong. So that's argument number one. I think it's sort of, in a very important sense, complements other work. If you think AI is going to be a big deal and you're like, how do we make that go well? I think it sort of complements that story. And I would argue that alignment and control alone are just not going to be enough. So resilience needs to be the sort of a third pillar there. The second argument I want to make is that resilience enables safe diffusion of AI capabilities. Now, you could ask, why do we want that in the first place? Why don't we just keep it locked up? I think there's two arguments for why that's not a sufficient or not a sort of satisfying answer to me. You could believe either of them or both. One, you might think that the fusion of AI capabilities just is unavoidable. And I think I basically sort of subscribe to that. I think we need plans that are robust, given the assumption that we're not going to stop AI diffusion. And I think we're seeing that, right? And then if you believe that, you start to notice that there's sort of two places where we need to think about safety broadly that are quite distinct in how we govern. So there's the question of the most frontier models that we have, and that sort of, at the time we initially get them, they'll sort of be in a very specific context. That will probably be within some like AI company. And that's a specific context within which we can govern and sort of control certain risks. But if we then think over time, those capabilities will diffuse more broadly, some of the affordances we used to have to make these systems secure will sort of fall away. So we'll have to deal with the same level of capabilities or similar level of capabilities in different regimes. So that's, Helen Toner has a sort of article about this, and she talks about the adaptation buffer. So the point between when we know what the most frontier capabilities are and this point sometime later in time when these capabilities will be sort of widely available. So we have some time to get ready between those to make that go okay. And I think resilience has an important role to play in that. But the second reason, and maybe I sort of even care more about that second reason, is that I think safe diffusion is desirable. Now, it's definitely desirable when we figured out how to make it safe. And it's like less desirable if it leads to the destruction of the sort of human civilization, right? In that case, it's not that desirable. But I think solving the problem of safe diffusion, I think, is a highly worthwhile problem to try to solve. Some of the reasons, the diffusion of AI capabilities would enable lots of things. It enables innovation, it enables science, and importantly, sort of just general global socioeconomic uplift, right? Because these capabilities can be used for a lot of good things, and we want that to be as broadly available as possible. To also talk about the innovation on science a bit more, I think it's kind of wild. Like, I often find myself these days in a situation where I'm like, I love innovation. I love science. It's so exciting. And I'm kind of a bit bummed out that I don't get to just be unambiguously excited about a lot of what's happening in innovation and science. Because currently we're like, man, but there's all these downside risks that we currently don't understand and don't have good stories for how to deal with. So if somehow we could get closer to a world where we're like, yep, we're sort of sufficiently ahead of the game, we've sort of built these like decentralized defenses against things going sort of locally wrong, and now we actually can, in a sort of more thoughtful way, be like, yeah, let's go explore, let's go innovate, and then do the science. I would love to live in that world, and I'd love to live in something that looks more like that world. And then, importantly as well, if we could get to safe diffusion, we could counteract a lot of sort of power centralization concerns, which I think could end up in very undesirable worlds as well. And I think so, again, that's a good reason for why it's worth working for figuring out how to do safe diffusion. Relying on governments for resilience might be both insufficient and or undesirable. So I think historically, actually, we've sort of relied a lot on, or sort of be able to benefit a lot from the state playing a central role in bolstering resilience. The market also has contributed to this, but it tends to be like a little bit trickier because I think the market tends to have a hard time sort of pricing in the sort of externalities that at least initially would have to drive work on resilience. So I think the state had to like historically step in there quite meaningfully. Now, I think going forward, if I imagine a world where we have widely distributed access to powerful AI capabilities, and I think about what does it look like for that to go well, I think what we need is increasingly more local defenses and decentralized control. So we'll have that capability, sort of that these AI capabilities available anywhere. I think as a regime where you're like with some sort of centralized way of noticing if something goes wrong and then intervening in that, or like imposing restrictions on these capabilities, I think is very brittle for many ways. I think it's brittle on the does it provide resilience question, but it's also, again, comes with these power centralization risks. So I think really like directionally, we really need to be moving into local defenses and decentralized control. And those things are less naturally in the remit of the government. It's not historically what the government has pushed for and what is sort of set up to do. So I think that just means that there's a lot of potential here to do stuff that would otherwise not be done. And the last reason, I think, to just mention here briefly, is that there's also certain short-term resilience interventions that would, in fact, in a short-term boost resilience, at least in a certain notion, that I think could be really sort of bad longer term, because you sort of can get quick fixes that then actually do this power centralization stuff. So, for example, surveillance, if you think someone very benevolent is using that data and reacting on it, could get you a lot of resilience, but it's an unstable world to get ourselves into. And then the last reason I want to emphasize is that differential progress means accelerating resilience tech could unlock outside impact. So very briefly, I imagine you're all kind of familiar with this terminology, but differential progress is just sort of the notion that the acceleration of certain technological capabilities relative to others is possible, and it's sort of an interesting notion to think about. So that's differential progress. And why is that relevant here? So this relies on the notion that technological progress and in general sort of like history, I guess, is path dependent. So it kind of matters what happens in what order. And we actually can sort of achieve certain things by getting the order right, roughly speaking. So what are some ways in which this cashes out? There's a very obvious one where by building the safety and resilience technology before catastrophic events, right, that really matters, right? That has a lot of path dependency. So if you get that differential progress right, well, that kind of actually is sort of like very good outsized impact or a big deal. Another one is that the faster we can sort of build the resilience, the faster we get the upside of the safe diffusion, essentially, or the fact that AI could really supercharge science and innovation. And I could actually imagine here a regime where we're sort of two counterfactual worlds, and figuring out the resilience a little bit sooner in one lets you sort of to go on this like exponential curve on innovation building on itself more unconstrainedly and faster, and that leading to worlds where suddenly down the line all the tech and science you've figured out in that society is just orders of magnitude more advanced. So that might be another way in which this differential progress thing could cash out. And then lastly, I think there's this question of what institutional regime we might be looking into, or I guess what trajectory we might be getting into. And again, I think here that these local defenses and this decentralized control, getting there sooner and possibly depending on your AI timelines, very soon, will be a big deal to avoid some of the so highly power centralized outcomes or trajectories. Okay, so this was some of my reasoning about why. I'm very quickly going to look at the chat whether I'm missed any. Okay, no, I think I've not missed any key questions. Cool. If you want to put up your hand now for any clarification on what I've been saying so far, feel free to do that. Cool. So how do we develop and enhance resilience? So I think that's really where I think the exciting and meaty stuff is happening. So the angle from which in our project we have approached this, and that's obviously not an exhaustive angle at all, but we were sort of interested in the question of what sort of important R&D priorities are out there that we should be tracking and that we should maybe be sort of working on having them built, right? So that poses the question, how would we identify R&D priorities, given that we can't look into the crystal ball and just know what the answer to that is? So what we've been playing around instead is like a handful of different sort of, we could call them sort of mental frames or like prompts or sort of like ways of thinking about these questions that sort of might throw up different insights, different ideas. One of them was this notion of resilience property. So what we did is we sort of thought about systems and thought about, okay, what instances where they had a lot of resilience, and we ask ourselves, what about them makes them resilient? What are sort of capacities that are sort of present in those systems that seem sort of conducive to resilience? And then thus, how could you emulate them? The point here really is that resilience isn't a single thing. It's sort of an aggregate property that a system starts to have. And the sort of things we think about there is there's very forecasting, there's sensing, there is sort of rapid reaction, there's sort of the meta loop of, hey, should we be updating how we even think about this feedback loop of how the resilience gets improved. There is historical case studies. We can look at specific systems or specific sort of breakthroughs we've done in the past and then think about, cool, like what is the core insight there? And then also how did we go from having that problem maybe to like actually having attack and having attack adopted, etc. We can think about tech trees, where what I'm interested in tech trees in particular is the forward chaining and the backward chaining. So it could be like, what's the tech stack that we have right now? And then incrementally moving forward, what could we be building and what is really interesting from a more resilience angle? Like what are sort of maybe the resilience pain points we have right now and how could we fix them, right? That's more the forward chaining action. And then we could also do the other way around where we say, what are sort of the far sort of branches of our tech tree where we're like, well, in principle, right, it should be possible to do X. And that would be a big deal for resilience. And then sort of backchain towards how do we get from where we are right now to there. So I think that's another exciting way to think about this. And then the last one I call end games. So that's basically just asking yourself the question, what would a fully resilient civilization or a fully resilient system in this case look like? And this is the one I'm going to sort of dive into, the one frame I'm going to dive into in this talk for reasons of time, but also because I think this is actually a very juicy, or I think it's a very juicy and joyful angle. So endgames, a little bit more, what do I mean? Yeah, I mean things like, what would it look like to just be resilient to X, right? What in principle would we have to have in place for that to be possible? Another similar prompt is something like, what would it look like for this domain to become decisively defense favored? So defense favored, I mean something like, as we sort of ramp up the capabilities on both offense and defense side, increasingly it's sort of like just clearly the case that defense wins out. And how do we move a given domain into that regime? I think for me, really that's, I think, often what the end game comes down to. And then a third prompt would be something like, imagine a wise future civilization that was sort of serious about figuring this thing out. What they had their shit together, what would they do? And these are some of the prompts. So this is kind of what I mean by an end game. Now, what are the goals here? What will we do that? Well, it helps us be ambitious, which I think is very useful often. It also helps us identify path dependency. So if we describe an end game and then we sort of backchain, right? Like backchaining the tech tree, like how will we get there? I think there's at least a potential that we would identify sort of branching points where like, actually, locally it maybe seemed like going left here gives us a bit more. We're not going to get into an end game that's actually defense favored. We need to build this other thing to get there. And then thirdly, I think why is it useful to be ambitious is like, because we want to avoid being superseded by AI progress, right? We kind of need to build stuff that's so much resilience boosting that it's not going to just be outdated by the AI capabilities on the offense side that will be available in 3 months from now. What are non-goals? Well, we're not trying to predict what exactly is going to happen. Now, predicting the future, I think there's anyway always a certain performative element to predicting the future, because by talking a lot about X going to happen, that can just make X more likely. So insofar, maybe we're like a little bit in the world where I'm like, I do in fact like want to move towards those end games. And if we do our job well, they become more likely. But we're not in the sort of more descriptive sense trying to predict the future exactly. We're also not trying to be authoritative. So this is not like, what is the single way we could get this right? Definitely not in the exercise we did. This was more trying to be thought-provoking and trying to sort of collect consideration we have right now. And what are limitations? Well, we might just not be foresighted enough. So there's an interesting balance of, are we being too overambitious and sort of imagining tech that we don't know how to get to, or actually are we sometimes not ambitious enough? That's, I think, sometimes interesting in the specific cases. And then also I think another interesting one is that even if we have an endgame scenario, there's still really hard choices about, for a given, say you have some amount of funding to give out, right? Should you be investing it in like more short-term gains, right? Okay, but I'm actually worried that within the next year something bad will happen and this defense would help with this, versus this might not cash out for another 3 or 5 or more years. But if it would be a big deal, like those trade-offs remain really hard. And I think there's more work we need to do to think about them sanely. But at least it gives us something to aim at. Okay. Yeah, I'm very interested in input. As I said, this is meant partially to be thought-provoking. I think this is our serious attempt, or current status serious attempt on this, but it's not meant to exclude other good things. I want to talk in remaining time through maybe up to 3 endgames. We'll see how I do on time. But cool. So biosecurity endgame. Okay. We can all sort of imagine what we're worried about in our sort of future biosecurity worlds. 3 pillars that sort of constitute that endgame. So imagine a civilization that's actually serious about getting this right. Those are sort of, I'll talk about them in a second. So first one, called this somewhat poetically metrology of pathogens. So what do we have here? Well, one, we have ubiquitous biosensing via sort of a dense, always-on network of environmental sensors. So this is metagenomics on steroids. This is in all the places where we can pick up new diseases, potential sort of fastly proliferating diseases. We will notice something coming up as soon as possible, right? That's one of the key things I think this mature civilization would have figured out, early detection. Now, what do we do with the sensory data that we're getting here? We'll have to screen this to some extent. We can definitely screen it against our sort of understanding of pathogens that we already have, right? Like we've already identified and screened certain pathogens and we know them and we can sort of identify, hey, do we see any of those? But I think we actually need a bit more than that as well. We need to be able to detect signs of potentially harmful and previously unseen pathogens, especially if there's certain properties we should be worried about. So for example, rapidly mutating, rapidly spreading, there's sort of high affinity to sort of bind to human cells. There's some properties there where I'm like, okay, these ones you should look out for, we need to detect early. And then also there's the privacy preserving decentralized synthesis screening. So all the machines where DNA or RNA segments can be synthesized should be a privacy preserving way to sort of scan, hey, what are you trying to print out here? Is this any of the known pathogens? Or is it some fragment that is worrying for some of these reasons and we are maybe not confident enough that wouldn't cause a problem that we couldn't deal with our other defenses? So that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2, we need to be able to react to any outbreak that happens. And I think here the keywords are rapid and local. So we need to be rapid, right? But local is also very important. And I think in particular, I think local production in our story is something that we want to emphasize. So local manufacturing of therapeutics at key points of care. So hospitals, airports, ports, etc. Like these are really the places where if you want to prevent a pandemic, this is where you gotta crack down first. And then what are we able to give people? We can hopefully build out a strong arsenal of very broad spectrum antivirals and monoclonal antibodies that actually are just helpful across a range of things. And then also where that breaks down, or we're sort of maybe to sort of later on after sort of initial phase to sort of improve the defenses, AI-driven design of new case-specific therapeutics. So that's my pillar, rapid and local response. And then thirdly, how can we sort of reduce the prevalence of any of this emergency stuff happening in the first place? Can we sort of dial up our ability to just not get any of this in the first place? I think there's some interesting things here. So one is like breakthroughs and sort of people's innate immunity. We don't understand, I'm not an expert here, but as far as I understand, there's actually a lot of interesting work. I think we're sort of at the cusp of being able to do more of that and like understanding the human immune system in the first place and being able to modulate more precisely how good it's working and how we can leverage that as part of the layers of defense in the biosecurity story. And then there's this idea of decontamination technology. So probably some of you are familiar with far UV, which is a really exciting technology here. There's maybe this question of like antimicrobial materials, right? Is there more material science that could be done that in our buildings and our infrastructure already starts to sort of just reduce that background risk of pathogen spreading, etc. And then there's the more stuff that we already know, right? Like we're just figuring out how do robust lockdown protocols work? How can we just get trusted and privacy preserving contact tracing? Because that's a big deal and the privacy preserving part we need to figure out. But afterwards, that will help a lot, PPs. So that's my 3 pillars for the epistemic story. Cyber-physical security endgame. How could we get there? 3 pillars are, I'm just going to start with verifiable secure code. So currently, code, a lot of things are running on code. Critical infrastructure is running on code. A lot of the modern civilization is running on code. But code is, like, in important places, extremely buggy. Seems like an issue. How can we fix that? There is, like, I'm going to get more ambitious as I'm talking here. There's workflows where we can that can help us translate legacy code, especially in sort of languages that are known to be prone to risks. So for example, C++ is an important example here. It has a lot of sort of memory issues. We make it much easier, much cheaper, much more agile to translate those into even just more secure code. And AI, I think, will make a really big difference there. So translate legacy code, like key sort of code bases that everyone relies on, into just more secure languages. And I feel like that's step number one. I feel like we're not even being too ambitious here. I think we're getting more ambitious once we start to, again, leverage AI to produce formally verified code. So by formally verified code, I mean you have a set of specifications, you write code, and you can prove that your code in fact meets all of these specifications. So this is something we know how to do. There is, for example, a formally verified microkernel, SCL4, that has really been tested pretty intensely, that in some sense does this, right? But it's currently very expensive, a lot of human effort that needs to go into this. Can we make that cheap and easy and sort of increasingly the default to do? That's a much more ambitious story. Now, one more thing to say in this branch is that even if we've verified that our code meets our specs, there's still a question about whether our specs are doing the thing we want to do. That one we can't prove away, that there's no proof that you get the right specs. But I think there's really a lot of sort of thick, interactive, iterative feedback loops we can deploy to thoroughly validate the specifications. A friend of mine has sort of coined the term vibe specking, right? We can get AI to help us write the specs in the first place. And then we need to sort of establish these workflows to validate whether the specs are what we want. But I think there's a lot we can do there. So pillar number 2, scalable. V&V means verification and validation for AI applications. So what I mean here is that this is going to be a bit abstract initially, and then I hope I can clarify a bit more. Scalable workflows that produce performant but narrow. I call it programs to be maximally specific. I think you could replace it with AI applications, although the story here is not that the AI has to be part of the application. But so scalable workflows to produce performant but narrow AI application that come with rigorous safety cases. Now, ideally, we would like those safety cases to actually involve quantitative guarantees. This is something my day job is trying to do, but I think it actually depends a bit on your application domain, whether quantitative guarantees is what is tractable to go for, and also maybe what is the fit to go for. So I think the more we're in safety critical domains, the more we really want to push into very high degrees of rigor when it comes to the safety case we can make. And then in other contexts where it's sort of more, hey, how am I using my AI in a Copilot or something? We don't really need to do it there, but we need maybe some other rigorous safety cases. We want to be able to produce that at scale. And then lastly, flexible hardware-enabled guarantees. So this is just to flag, this is some work I've done in the past, so a little bit shooting my horn here, although I think there's a general sort of notion here that I think is worth pointing out, and very excited for sort of counter proposals or sort of variations of this work. But what's the idea here? Well, I would like that the hardware layer where the world's computes run on, and increasingly more critical stuff will be run on that hardware layer. I think that hardware layer offers a bunch of affordances for some of the stuff we're talking about here. And I think in particular what we want here, secure, privacy-preserving, and temper-responsive modules that enable decentralized enforcement of key societal safeguards. So imagine society could come together and sort of say to itself, look, we want to use AI very broadly. I want to give people freedom to use it in the ways they want, but some stuff has a lot of negative externalities on all of us. So let's agree that some stuff we're not fine with. And let's say that the hardware layer itself will sort of refuse to execute certain operations, certain instructions that we've agreed we're collectively not fine with doing. And then we implement that on the hardware in a way that no sort of single entity, single power can sort of post hoc come in and sort of change the rules for them a little bit. But this is something we collectively agree on, and then we decentralize in a decentralized way, enforce this. So I think we could get a long way. We could get the privacy, the confidentiality, the integrity. No one is sort of backdooring and just messing with the compute you wanted to run. But we could still sort of only get conditional availability, sort of conditional guarantees that you actually can run the thing you want to run. Because if you want to run something that's nefarious, we're collectively not okay, so you can't do that. But you can use it for everything else. So that's the dream here. And there's a lot of open technical questions, how to implement this, and then also how do we define what those rules should exactly be. Definitely hard, but we're talking about ambitious, so this is why I included it. And then I'm just going to do my very last end game, and then there's time for question. So epistemic resilience, how we'll do that? Again, 3 pillars. So first one, verified sensors, verified sources. So imagine a world where sort of the sensors, especially sort of all the key sensors where we sort of get the sort of data from that feeds into our collective sense making, right? This is a bit broadly defined, but you can imagine about the sensors that we use when we run experiments, like scientific experiments, right? So that's the data that feeds into our scientific knowledge. We could talk about other sensors too, right? But definitely, I think we want to cover the scientific sort of experimental sensors, maybe also some of the other ones. Those sensors should have robust cyber-physical security, right? Like you shouldn't be able to tamper with them and suddenly have them not have some of the properties that we want. And then it would be great if those sensors would be collecting that data and in some shape or form kind of committing that data to some blockchain, right? In some cryptographically secure way. We want to be able to openly track that data, including the metadata, right? So the data is only valuable if we also know when was it collected, how was it collected, maybe who collected it, with what methods, etc. Because if you don't have that data, then you don't know how to interpret the rest. So verified sensor, right, could do that. We sort of had reliable knowledge and could sort of track in this and sort of irrevocably link that data and that metadata together. That provides this very interesting sort of basis for all the other science and reasoning we want to do. So that's step number 2. And then imagine we maybe even have sort of our like future archive where scientists could log their like pre-registered hypotheses, forecast results, metadata code, all of that. And that will all be on some shared blockchain and we could reuse that, but also it's up there and safe and doesn't get fudged with. I think another one is sort of in the verified sensors, the lowest level of where we do reasoning over, we would want to know what are AI generated outputs. So some sort of watermarking or some future version of that. So once we have that layer secured, what do we do then? I think another important tree is that not everyone is a scientist, not everyone is like at the frontier of a field, but we also need to be able to do the robust sense making in other domains. And I think if the more we get to sort of robust difference chains, that will be sort of resilience increasing. So we can make traceable claims that feeds back, that builds on our verified sensors, reputation tracking done really well. There's this like notion of a scalable reflection technology that exploits the inherent asymmetry in truth seeking. So what I'm imagining here is that I think, and if we get lucky or if we are lucky in the world we're actually in, then truth seeking is actually sort of defense favored in the sense of some of you might be familiar with the debate setup, right? It's easier to defend the true claim than it is to defend the wrong claim, at least in the limit, at least in certain limits. So what if we really leaned into that and built our epistemic infrastructure upon sort of that asymmetry? Some examples, prediction markers, I think already pointing in this direction. Like with AI, we could maybe make them really well, sort of high liquidity, because a lot of AIs could be trading on it. Community nodes, an example, the debate setup I've already mentioned. Habermas machine was some work there that can help facilitate collective deliberation, maybe elicit cruxes, elicit disagreements in productive ways. If we want to be really ambitious, we maybe get even to some sort of Bayesian oracle. Like there's some AI-related work on this where we could sort of like increasingly query an AI system that has digested all our scientific knowledge and get to increasingly confident Bayesian estimates of like the true answer to certain questions. Not sure we don't know whether this is possible, but that might be in the bucket of things we get to. And then lastly, another thing I'm excited about is these collaborative version controls and open modeling platforms. So I'm a little bit imagining Wikipedia, but better. Instead of just like plain text and hyperlinks, what we get is like actual mathematical models where we can input the parameters. If it's up to me, they are even imprecise, probabilistic or so, but we'll see whether we get there. But they're sort of like much more expressive than plain text actually can be, but have very similar, but what if they had very similar features around getting the collaborative version controlled nature of that well. So that could be really valuable epistemic resource. And then the last pillar here is that I think the world I imagine, the public space of the public epistemic space, probably I think we might have to give up on that mostly. I think that will mostly be untrusted because it's so cheap, right? It will be increasingly cheap to produce AI-produced propaganda or AI-produced sort of content that's kind of exploits human psychology. So we might have to give up on that a little bit, but we can maybe get pretty powerful personal sort of filters for this sort of propaganda, manipulation attacks, social engineering attacks, especially attacks that sort of exploit weaknesses in the human psychology. And then have those personal sort of epistemic guardians, AI systems, also be able to sort of like draw on that wealth of tech that I've already talked about to empower sort of individuals to make more informed choices. In my mind, this doesn't come down to here is the true belief that you should believe. It comes down to more things like, look, we don't really know whether like A or B is more true. But what we, for example, know is that you can't believe A and B at the same time because they imply that they can't be both true. So what we can sort of enforce more is coherence of the world. Some beliefs imply that other beliefs can't be true at the same time. We might not be always able to judge which among two coherent views of the world, which one is the true one. But we can, for example, figure out that they're like mutually exclusive. And we might even be able to generate where the crux is here. What is the empirical data that we could figure out to help us adjudicate which of the ones is sort of more likely. So I think that's how I think about the empowerment end of this. Okay, so that was my last end game. Very quick summary. I believe AI resilience is a key pillar in making things go well with transformative AI. I think there's many exciting R&D opportunities to be discovered and importantly built. Like I want us to avoid just analyzing this stuff. I want us to build it. I want us to do a lot of building because I think we need it and we need it now. And I think there's a lot of alpha here as well. So there's a lot of alpha in taking transformative AI seriously in the first place. There's a lot of alpha in taking differential technological progress seriously and just being like, okay, maybe I should be ambitious in this way because that's the part of the tech tree we need to get to eventually. We want to move into these sort of decisively defense-favored and regimes. And I think there's a lot of alpha in building these decentralized control solutions because it's not very obvious who else will be doing it, if not us. Yeah, and ultimately, I think we should be building a lot of the tech as soon as possible. Thanks so much. We had a lot of conversations with lots of great people. There's a lot of prior work that we're building on here, but that's a snapshot of what we've been working on.
Well, thank you so much, Nora, for the great presentation. I think we can quickly move into the Q&A. We have a couple questions lined up, both Mahan and Kevin. So Mahan, why don't you go first, and then we'll pass it to Kevin.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was super interesting. I was just wondering, conceptually thinking of things in terms of anti-fragility, whether that might have any impact on this versus resilience. But also, if I may, like more maybe important question, like to what when you said we need to build and we need to be fast and so on, to what extent are you yourselves internally taking that seriously in terms of like building out a bunch of startups and all kinds of things to make this move fast?
Yeah, so regarding the anti-fragility point, I essentially use resilience and anti-fragility here as synonyms. I know that the term was coined basically in the way I mean to use it, and there's a way of defining resilience that's more in the like more brittle kind of interpretation. But yeah, I do. By resilience, I mean not let's never have something bad happen. I mean let's make sure nothing bad ever happens that would be so bad that we're like out of the game. And then yeah, taking it seriously. Well, I mean, what should I speak for? I mean, I'm trying to take this pretty seriously. I mean, Arya is trying to accelerate a lot of ambitious research. I'm giving this talk I'm not speaking for Arya this talk. I'm giving this talk in my personal capacity. But yeah, I think I and the ecosystem around me is trying to do what we're currently in position to do to help accelerate science innovation and science entrepreneurship in this direction. But yeah, I would love much more of.
Great. Thank you. Kevin, did you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
I had several. Nora, this is great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love to hear how you're thinking about this because there are, in my opinion, not enough folks thinking about sort of the meta picture of how to become more resilient, and in particular, how to prioritize our investments in which sorts of defenses in the run-up to transformative AI. That is our game about surviving the run-up? Is our game trying to reduce costs to partly aligned AIs to encourage them to help protect us somewhat later on? And how should we be prioritizing our efforts between working with AI directly and building world of atoms defenses where we may have comparative advantages for some time? I think that's my overall picture, and I have more questions, but I'd love to hear your initial response to that.
Yeah, I mean, all great questions, and I'm far from definite answers to any of them. So yeah, I think the prioritization point, in some senses, is like I feel like this is one of the big ones I'm like grappling with at the moment, because some of these trade-offs feel like nearly incommensurable, at least in the terms I'm currently putting them to myself. I'm like, sure, you got to arrive side, but I don't really know how to compare these. I mean, my personal intuition is more leaning to, look, we need to sort of do the sort of things that where like it plausibly looks like winning, right? So I'm pretty keen to sort of differentially get a bit more work on the more ambitious worlds. I think there's one meta answer to this, which is something like the anytime algorithm, which is like, at any point in time, we'd like to be as ready as possible across time. So we definitely should be allocating resources across the space. My current impression is that we're like at the margin a bit under investigating in thinking through these tech trees enough, so that we could be identifying, hey, actually there's like this thing that we should be doing that's useful in the short term, but also gets us onto the right tech tree. But yeah, we'll see whether, we're hoping to maybe get to a little bit more better operational answers as to how to think about this, but I don't have that much to say about this at the moment. In terms of using AI, so my guess here would be, I think a lot of the solutions will look like leaning heavily into AI, but I think in the right sort of way. So I'm less thinking about sort of just outsourcing certain tasks entirely. I think like AI is not equal as AI, right? So there's the biggest model ever, and like that will be very smart and whatever. I'm like, that will do a bunch of things, but I think I'm actually pretty keen, and I think I've mentioned this in the talk as well, like we can produce smaller, narrower system that we can actually make safety claims about, because they're not autonomous in general, right? Like we don't know how to make safety claims about autonomous general systems, I think we just don't, and maybe we could never. I think we can make safety claims, and actually pretty well, about narrow systems. And I think these narrow systems could get us a long way. And I think that's something I definitely think we should be leaning into a lot. And then I think also the notion of what's the infrastructure we should be building right now to sort of really be able to leverage the AI as it gets better, right? Build the infrastructure, have some place where you plug in your AI, and your solution gets better as AI gets better. So I do think we should bet on that quite a lot. I'm sure you asked different questions, but I forgot the rest of your prompts.
I think a lot of it also boils down to how exactly should we be analyzing what the tech tree looks like, which branches are dangerous, and which ones actually harbor defenses that are cross-domain. So in bio, for example, I broadly agree with your plan, with the exception of medical countermeasures, because with all due respect, if the adversary is anywhere near as good as I am, and I expect with AI, the adversaries in future will be better, you should treat all of biology as hardware insecure. To say that it does not matter what kind of antiviral software you install, it is hopeless. If the adversary gets information back, it's inside, the system is lost. So maybe we can try to put in software that at least prevents your system from spewing more attacks to everyone else, but that's about the best you could probably plausibly hope for. But the solution then is, as you outlined, on its network monitoring, and then putting up firewalls when necessary, and eventually shutting off unauthorized biological information transfer. That's just crazy. No one would ever design a system that way. That's just how evolution handed to us. But by thinking about it like a public health problem, or like hoping that biotech can fix the problem, I think is not the answer. Speaking as a biotechnologist, I have just given up. I'm sorry. It is just so offense dominant. There are so many ways to subvert a biological system that we just cannot fix and cannot hope to fix anywhere in the near term. But if we just install enough far UV, or even just sequence everything and then put on the mask soon enough, then we're safe against everything pandemic class. But I just worry in the longer term, because their mirror looks like the sort of thing where, oh, that's nice. You all die anyway. We probably can build defenses that would survive against that. I'm not super optimistic, because better future, more competent adversaries can probably build on the basic platform of mirror bacteria to overcome the defenses we might make against the basic thing. That is, they're starting from a given advantage. The obvious solution there is abandon being biological entirely.
Right.
So it's
the one in particular was one where we're like, so is the end game here that we're just not biological? And then they were like, well, that feels a little bit like a crop out. I'm like, this is a valid discussion to have, but let's try to like grapple with the other problem at least.
Yeah. So, and then I think the last one then is just with the prioritization. You've talked a lot about local defenses, and I agree. I mean, you can't rely on governments for this. In fact, the whole notion that an N=1 government is entrusted with foresight and preparedness, that's just silly. But to what extent should we be planning on sort of graceful fallback? That is, in worlds where you expect there to be major disruption or catastrophe of some sort, and essentially the nastier you believe the tech tree looks in terms of how many fruits are poisoned, then maybe the more likely that is, then maybe what we need is to plan for what happens when this massive supply chain unravels. Or is it not going to unravel? I have no idea how robust the supply chain actually is when really stressed because we have no data. What are your thoughts on that? What does local mean? Does it mean right now we're trying to build the stockpile of respirators for the US and Canada so a wildfire pandemic doesn't bring everybody down? And that's just because we're A, here, and B, that's where we think we can raise the money to do it. It's not going to be from government, though. And then we would love to extend that to Europe and liberal-ish, democratic-ish East Asia and Oceania and so forth. But does that mean you want to plan for basically autarky? And at what scale? Does that mean the US and Canada should plan to cooperate with each other and that's it? Australia should plan to go it alone or maybe with New Zealand? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you're also raising sort of like how much, because all of these systems are interlinked, right? Like how much breakdown do we need to be able to deal with? So I can't fully answer, but just some things like on the local defenses, I mean, like even there, I'm like, yes, this is why you need local production capacity, whether that's for your PPEs or whether that's for your antibiotics or whether that's for some amount of food. So having local detection and production capacity does actually give you some added resilience for these like breakdowns of these sort of intertwined systems. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure whether that was your question, but like, I think governments play some role there, but it's actually at that point, it's kind of local governments rather than like state government, which we usually think about when we say like the government will do X. So I don't know. I think even in the world you outlined there, I'm still like, yep, I think local is really what we need to strengthen. Yeah.
And does that mean that we should be using AI more to figure out how to become more robust with possibly simpler technologies, or at least becoming independent of things we have to ship from across the world with multiple manufacturing steps?
So it is one of the reasons why I'm keen on safe diffusion, because I want also the capabilities of AI that AI would afford us to be locally available. And this is also why I'm very bullish on the compute hardware stack as being a sort of critical piece that we need. In general, I think you mentioned this before, I haven't noted this in this talk, but something that we're thinking about is, so there's specific resilience tech we can think of that is like very domain specific, right? We invent this here, but there's actually other pieces of tech that we notice. I want to call them sort of commons because they afford you a lot of resilience across the stack. I think hardware-enabled guarantees is one of them. I think more robust supply chains, stuff like that, also really work across the stack. But I think the hardware level, I feel like in a future world where not everything is crashed down, we're actually still kind of functional. So much will be running on AI, on that hardware layer in particular. So I think there's a lot of affordance we could get from that. On the no, you're not allowed to do certain, or maybe you can only run models if you can certify that you have unlearned certain virology expertise, even stuff like that. So I think if you want to think big, you can get quite some places there. We'll see where we get with the tech in time. Yeah.
I know we're out of time. That's been very helpful. I'd love to keep talking about this.
Yeah,
Thanks.
This is great. Thank you.
Well, we're past the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions. Thank you so much, Nora, for joining us. It's been a total pleasure to have you with us here today. And with that being said, I guess we'll just see you all next month. So thanks for joining and have a great rest of your day.